Would you all please take your seats? Please take your seats as we will begin the program. Please find your seats. I want to be on the other.
It is
Maybe.
not very loud.
No, they control it. Thank you. Good day and welcome to the 29th annual observance of the United Nations International Day of Older Persons. My name is Cynthia Stewin, and I'm privileged to be the chair of the NGO Committee on Aging in New York. Our theme today is the journey to age equality. It is a life course journey, and the inequalities that happen along one's lifespan impact us profoundly throughout our life course. Children born into poverty, receiving inadequate health care, inadequate education, are doomed to a life of inequality. But today, we're focusing on that lifetime of inequalities, and we are focusing on the growing population of older persons and the opportunities and the challenges that global aging provide. Today, we will hear of the need for transformation. As many of our speakers today will address, we need to move away from what was traditionally the 3 stages of life: early education, work life, and retirement, to a multi-stage life where education is lifelong, where work is not one single career, but perhaps many, each requiring retooling or honing one's skills for new opportunities. The world of work, whether out of necessity or out of fulfillment, the older population is a resource to be tapped, not shunned away. Ageism is a term that was made popular here in the United States by Dr. Robert Butler, the founding director of our National Institute on Aging. In his book, Why Survive? Being Old in America, it was published 50 years ago. We have a long way to go. Research has documented that age stereotypes adversely affect our attitudes, cognition, and behavior. And research has also documented that negative health outcomes are associated with ageism. The good news is that people with more positive age beliefs seem to do better as we age. So our own attitude about aging is critically important. New research in the area of dementia has also shown that positive age beliefs seem to have a positive delay or even prophylactic effect in delaying onset of dementia. What is disheartening, though, is that people's ageist attitudes, something that we can't control, can have a comparable negative impact on us as older adults. Leading up to the decade of healthy aging, 2020-2030, the World Health Organization has launched its global campaign against ageism. There are really many wonderful resources for this campaign on the WHO website, and you'll be hearing more about that. In our world of rapid population aging, the journey to age equality can only be achieved by promoting social, economic, and political inclusion of older persons and ensuring equal opportunities throughout the life course. Today, we'll focus on pathways of coping with existing and preventing future old age inequalities. Argentina is our sponsor for this 29th annual observance of the UN International Day of Older Persons, joined by the other 25 member countries of the Group of Friends of Older Persons, and with generous support from AARP. The program is organized by the NGO Committee on Aging of New York in close collaboration with the UN Department of Economic and Social Affairs Program on Aging Unit. Let me now introduce our wonderful chair of today's observance, Maud Bruce Aboot. She represents the International Federation of Associations of the Elderly, and she is a member of the Executive Committee of the NGO Committee on Aging in New York. Maud?
Thank you, Cynthia, for your introduction. We're many here today, both on the podium and in the audience. I like that. To me, it means that both aging and longevity are receiving much-needed attention, and that our team, the Journey to Age Equality, is of concern to all of us. In addition to you being here today, this event is being webcasted on the UN website. Hence, those not here today can follow it, and you can recommend it to others, even afterwards. For me, it's been an honor to be the 2019 UN IDOP chair and to organize this event in unison with the team of Amal at DESA, the NGO Committee on Aging, and so many others. I have had the help of many. I will mention nobody in specific, but nobody's forgotten. As for housekeeping, you have programs in front of you with biographies that you can consult. You have index cards to use for the Q&A part of the panel. And if you would like to access the program online, there is a URL that will be put up on the screen shortly. You see it up there. You also have headphones for hearing, but there is no translation. To reach restrooms, you can just exit where you came in, up on the third level, and turn to the left. Please turn off the ringers of your mobile phones, but please feel free to take photographs, film, and post on social media using our hashtag #UNIDOP. I return the floor to you, Cynthia.
As Maud said, the bios are all in your program, so today we will dispense with any long introductions of our many speakers. Ambassador Martín García Moritán is the permanent representative of the mission of Argentina to the United Nations. Ambassador Moritán also chairs the General Assembly's open-ended working group for the purpose of strengthening the protection of human rights of older persons. Argentina has been a long-time sponsor of this annual observance and for the rights of older persons. We are most grateful to you and all of your support on behalf of us. I introduce you now to His Excellency, Ambassador Moritán.
Thank you so much, and good morning, and thank you for being here. It's an honor and a privilege every year to be here to commemorate the International Day of Older Persons at the UN headquarters, and this is the 29th year, so happy birthday to all of us. I would like to start by thanking the NGO Committee on Aging New York and the IDOP Subcommittee on DESA for organizing this event, which serves as an important platform to engage in a substantive and meaningful debate about the situation of the human rights of older persons and to raise awareness of the importance that this issue has at our present time. Like every year, it's a great pleasure for Argentina to partner with you in order to commemorate this important day, and I'm very happy to have my colleague from Chile sharing the group of friends on aging with us this year as well. This year, our theme for the International Day is a journey to age equality, which is a cornerstone of the human rights framework and directly affects the enjoyment of the human rights of older persons. I'm sure that this debate will be very fruitful and will trigger off key issues and ideas from which to move forward in order to assure the protection and fulfillment of the human rights of all older persons. In this regard, today I would like to reflect upon the relationship between the significant role of older people as active contributors to sustainable social and economic development and the full realization of their human rights in order to achieve equality for all. According to the World Population Prospects 2019, published last June by the UN Department of Economic and Social Affairs, DESA, between 2019 and by 2030, the number of persons aged 60 years or over is projected to grow by 38%, from 1 billion to 1.4 billion, globally outnumbering youth. Addressing this global issue now will not only guarantee the protection of the human rights of all older persons, but it will also pave the way for states to be better prepared to face the future challenge of an ever faster growing aging population. This reality imposes us the crucial challenge of rethinking and redefining the way we see, conceive, and address aging. It will be impossible to achieve and long-lasting development if we leave behind the fastest growing social group. In this regard, population aging must be addressed from a human rights-based approach in order to ensure the full realization of the rights of older people under equal conditions, and any strategy of sustainable development must include them as active subjects and agents of change. The Secretary General, in his last report on the follow-up to the Second World Assembly on Aging, drew attention to the significant implication that the inclusion of older people may have in attainment of the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs. Additionally, he highlighted the fact that in the voluntary national reviews presented during the high-level political forum this year, few countries, very few, reported the inclusion of aging-related priorities in their national sustainable development strategies. The maximum pledge of the 2030 Agenda of leaving no one behind calls us for action to scale up our efforts that the full exercise of the rights of all older people is not only respected, but also effectively guaranteed by the states. The lack of visibility of older persons in the 2030 Agenda could well be understood considering the following premise: in order to guarantee an age-inclusive implementation of the 2030 Agenda and attainment of the Sustainable Development Goals, it is of utmost importance to be clear about the obligations of the states to assure the effective enjoyment of their human rights. In this respect, according to the independent expert, Mrs. Rosa Kornfeld, the lack of a wide and integrated international legally binding instrument when it comes to the promotion and protection of the human rights and dignity of older persons has strong practical implications. It is still very difficult to clearly establish the obligations of member states towards the human rights of older persons, since the current legal framework does not work as a guide for governments and their governmental policies. This absence of a specific legal instrument may also explain the lack of attention to the specific problems of older persons in the global regulatory framework, in particular the SDGs. Likewise, during the last session of the open-ended working group on aging, some delegations, as well as several NGOs and national human rights institutions stress the need for an international legally binding instrument that can clearly establish the obligations of member states when it comes to the protection of the human rights of older persons. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights is a milestone document which underpins all international human rights law and inspires us to continue to work to ensure all people can gain freedom, equality, and dignity. However, the existing framework of international human rights law does not recognize age as a cause of forbidden discrimination, which constitutes a clear deficiency in the current system and contributes to make many serious violations of the human rights of older persons invisible. Likewise, even though the general principle of the international legal framework related to the right to equality and non-discrimination is included in most of a state's national laws, in almost all cases, there are not specific references to the rights of older persons and to discrimination on the basis of age. It is clear that the enjoyment of all human rights is dismissed with age due to the negative notion that older persons are less productive, less valuable to society, and a burden to the economy and to younger generations. Also, there is an idea that they are a vulnerable group that needs special care and protectionist measures. Distinguished friends, distinguished colleagues, in our working group, we are proud to have been recognized as the most prominent international forum specifically devoted to the rights of older persons. The open-ended working group has acted as a platform from which the wide and active participation of all the relevant stakeholders has given visibility to the need for promoting, protecting, and strengthening the human rights of older persons, and has helped reflect upon innovative courses of action that will be the best meet their current and future needs. I would also like to emphasize the relevant role played by the civil society organizations, which have always been key actors in identifying areas where the human rights of the elderly need to be strengthened, pointing out the gaps in existing international framework and suggesting how best to address them. To conclude, I would like to end by renewing Argentina's firm commitment towards advancing the issues related to aging in the United Nations and to advocate for the inclusion, meaningful participation, and full enjoyment of their human rights by older persons. I look forward to listening to the presentations of our distinguished panelists, and I'm sure that we will have a very interesting discussion on these issues of aging. Once again, I thank you all for being here, and I wish you a very rich and successful session. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Ambassador Moritan. Nazli Bernal-Prado is a delegate and first secretary of the Permanent Mission of Chile to the United Nations. She recently became chair of the Group of Friends of Older Persons. This group, as noted, is comprised of 25 member states, and it was established in 2013 with the purpose of promoting and mainstreaming the rights and dignity of older persons from a holistic, humanistic human rights perspective and a developmental approach. I introduce you now to Ms. Nazli Bernal-Prado.
Thank you very much, Cynthia. Excellencies, distinguished guests, dear colleagues. At the outset, I would like to, I have the honor to speak on behalf, as Cynthia already said, on behalf of the Group of Friends of Older Persons. And we are very proud to co-sponsor this important event. I would like, at the outset, to warmly thank the organizers for convening this event to commemorate the 29th anniversary of the International Day of Older Persons. The commemoration of this day was officially recognized by the United Nations in 1990 with the General Assembly Resolution 45106 to remind us of the essential contribution that older persons continue making to our society and to provide them the adequate guarantees to fulfill this purpose, particularly fully recognizing their human rights. The increase in the number of older persons globally and the growing trend of aging societies all over the world represent a significant change to the demographic structures of our societies and impose new challenges to development. This reality emphasizes the urgency to recognize that greater attention needs to be paid to the specific challenges faced by older persons in the global development policy framework, including identifying possible gaps and how best to address them. We believe this demographic trend presents both a significant opportunity and a challenge that emphasizes the need to take effective measures against aging and to view older persons as active contributors to society and not as passive receivers of care and social protection. This is the key to achieve success in the 2030 Agenda and the opportunity to reaffirm the commitment reflected in the political declaration adopted in Madrid in 2002 to respond to the opportunities and challenges of population aging in the 21st century and to promote the development of a society for all ages. Dear colleagues, we believe that sustainable and adequate social and economic policies for older persons can be achieved through our shared efforts. The international community must work together to ensure the well-being of older persons, their full empowerment, as well as the promotion and protection of their human rights. It is further of particular relevance that intergenerational dialogue, solidarity, and coexistence are actively fostered, making our society truly cohesive. Finally, I would also like to highlight the valuable efforts by civil society in improving the situation of older persons worldwide, and to reiterate that the group of friends of older persons will continue to work tirelessly to promote the rights of all older persons around the world. Thank you so much.
We thank you for these encouraging and committed opening remarks. We're now going to listen to a video message by His Secretary, His Excellency, Mr. Secretary General Antonio Guterres.
I'm pleased to convey my best wishes to this commemoration. Population aging is transforming societies worldwide. Older people now outnumber children under the age of 5. By 2030, 1.4 billion people will be at least 60 years old. Governments have a duty to promote the social, economic, and political inclusion of all. This global pledge is enshrined in the Sustainable Development Goals. Yet, we still see deep inequalities in people's experiences in later life. The United Nations is committing to do its part to prevent discrimination and ensure the full participation of older people. Indeed, all societies benefit from the knowledge, wisdom, and experience of older people, and we should do everything we can to make such contributions possible. Thank you for your dedication to our shared vision of empowerment, inclusion, and equality for people of all ages.
We thank Mr. Secretary General for his support and encouragement. Now, as you see on your programs, we have two keynote speakers. They are both economists and both British. Paul Ladd will address population aging and dimensions of inequality from a UN and especially a strategic development perspective. Andrew Scott will address longevity from both a society and individual perspective. Rather than say more, I will now leave the floor to Paul Ladd, Director of the UN Research Institute for Social Development. As you can see in his biography, Paul has worked towards the strategic development goals and has long and rich experience in economic, financial, and development policy. Paul, the floor is yours.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Maud, for the kind introduction, and to all the organisers of this event. It's a pleasure to be with you here today to celebrate the International Day of Older Persons at the United Nations and to recognise in the audience many friends and colleagues. I'd like to do 4 things in the time that I have. First, put some basic facts about ageing on the table to set the scene for the discussion. Second, place this seismic demographic shift of ageing within the context of other trends that the world is experiencing on inequalities, climate change, and technology. Third, ask how the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development addresses ageing and how we can use it to help the agenda. And lastly, propose 7 steps, 7 actions on the journey to age equality. What are 7 things we could usefully do together to ensure that all older persons can live in dignity, where their skills and experience are rewarded and where they are treated equally and without discrimination? So first of all, some facts. We've heard some of them already. I also have to thank the excellent work that's undergone in the UN's DESA, the Population Division, for pulling all this together on a regular basis. It really is excellent groundwork. It shows that the world is undergoing nothing less than a demographic revolution. We continue to put more people on the planet, somewhere in the range of 9.4 to 12.7 billion people by the end of this century. And we already know that this population is getting older. So in 2018, for the first time, the number of older people older than 65 outnumbered children under the age of 5. From today until 2050, the proportion of the population aged 65 or over is expected to more than double. And by 2030, the deadline of the 2030 Agenda that governments agreed to here in New York in 2015, the share of older persons is expected to grow in all regions. Putting the dividing line at 65 is going to become increasingly irrelevant. The number of people over the age of 80 is growing as life expectancy stretches. There were 125 million of the oldest old at the start of the SDGs. There will be 200 million people over the age of 80 by 2030 and over 430 million by 2050. And lastly, there is a strong gender perspective to this aging because women tend to live longer. So in 2019, women make up 55% of people aged 65 years or over, and 61% of those aged 80 or over. Now, aging is probably the most important demographic shift that we're experiencing, but it's not the only one. We also have shifting patterns of fertility, greater numbers of people migrating to other countries, and more people living in cities. So in 2017, there were an estimated 258 million people living in a country different from the one in which they were born. And within 30 years, 2/3 of us will live in cities. Now, these demographic shifts are not the only global megatrends shaping the prospects of a sustainable world and decent lives for all. Let me cover climate change and technology briefly, and then inequalities in a bit more depth. These shifts bring challenges for older persons in and of themselves, but we also have to think about how they interact with each other. So on climate change, the impacts we've already locked in through past and current emissions leave older persons tragically more exposed. It's a well-reported fact that the heat waves in Europe in the last few years from successively hot summers have disproportionately killed older people. We have more granular figures on hurricanes in the United States. As Professor Deborah Carr from Boston University has found, while older people make up 12% of the overall population in the US, they made up 2/3 of the estimated 1,800 people who died in Hurricane Katrina, and more than half of those who were killed by Hurricane Sandy. Now, those are heat waves in Europe and hurricanes in the United States, powerful countries with lots of assets. But what about the countries where we have weaker evidence or no evidence at all, where people may be less visible? On technology, no one can really know with any certainty how fast these frontiers will evolve. There should be tremendous scope for strengthening the inclusion of and improving the life experience of older people through new health technologies, access to lifelong learning opportunities, access to forms of continued employment, and cleaner environments. But this will depend critically on whether older people can afford and access these technologies. Perhaps more importantly, it will depend on whether older persons are involved in the process of innovation itself, so that new technologies reflect their priorities. Both of these examples on climate and technology resonate with a broader point about inequalities. Now, there are different types of inequality. Inequalities related to money, in income, and in wealth, but also horizontal inequalities, including those that may arise because of characteristics of gender, ethnicity, disability, or age, or combinations thereof. Now, I want to say a few words about each of those, and then on the relationship between inequalities now and future aging. So it's a bit of a mixed and complicated picture, but in the end, not very positive. Economists talk about inequality between countries and inequality within countries. Now, some countries in the global south, developing countries, are growing faster than industrialized countries. So they're catching up, and that's placing a downward pressure on inequality between countries. There are some outliers, mostly countries in conflict or facing insecurity, but overall the world is moving closer together on that narrow measure of money, income, or wealth. But when we look at within-country inequality, we see a different picture. In the last 30 years, inequality has risen in most advanced industrialized countries. In many Latin American and Caribbean countries, it's fallen a bit, but it was already very high. In other low and middle-income countries, some have risen and some have fallen, but in the most populous, China, India, and Indonesia, they have all risen, and not inconsiderably. So as a whole, this means that when we weight by population, and inequality has also risen in the United States, the global Gini coefficient, which is how economists measure inequality, has risen from 0.37 to 0.41 on average. So all of these calculations are based on household surveys, but these typically miss the incomes of the very richest, the elites, the 1%, or even the 0.1%. And there's growing evidence that the incomes and wealth of these super rich people have been growing much, much faster. The latest iteration of Oxfam's inequality headline is that 26 people in the world, all men, own as much as the poorest 50% of the global population. Now, at the same time, in many high and middle-income countries, real wages for many at the bottom of the distribution have stayed flat, and pensions have become less generous. There's been a downward pressure on tax receipts, in part because a lot of all that wealth has been squirreled overseas in tax havens. And that's placed pressure on services and infrastructure in many countries, rich and poor. Now, of course, you can be old and very wealthy, but for the general population, the erosion of pensions and services is a strong contributing factor to old age poverty. Now, beyond money, inequality, like poverty, has many dimensions. There can be inequality in accessing services, inequality in political voice, inequalities because of discrimination or disrespect, and inequalities that exist purely because of someone's characteristics, their gender, age, ethnicity, their physical and mental health, marital status, sexuality, or whether they've moved or been displaced to a different country. And these inequalities can overlap and reinforce. So if you're an older woman with your family in another country with fragile health, you face potentially multiple inequalities. So lastly, just a few words on aging and inequalities together. What will aging look like in the future because of inequalities today? In short, more unequal societies now are going to lead to more unequal aging processes. That's because inequalities and relative disadvantage compound over time, over the course of a life. A child starting her life in an unequal society with patchy education and poor health is less likely to find decent employment, less likely to save through her pension or otherwise, and will face greater challenges in older age. In short, there will be a wider gap in the experience of aging because of inequalities today. So with that complexity, with that set of overlapping macro challenges and overlapping inequalities, what does the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development bring? And how can it be used to improve the lives of all groups, including older persons? So the 2030 Agenda was agreed by member states in September 2015. It seeks to support a transition to sustainable development in all its dimensions, including through setting 17 Sustainable Development Goals and 169 targets covering aspects of economic, social, and environmental sustainability. Now, a long and extensive consultation process informed the content of that agenda. National-level consultations were complemented by surveys and thematic consultations, including on governance, inequalities, and demographic change. Now, many of the people in this room contributed evidence, perspectives, case studies, and lobbied for the explicit inclusion of older people. The stakeholder groups and the NGO Committee on Aging, all of the NGOs from different parts of the world who could put something on the table, all played a key role. They formed coalitions also with groups focused on youth, on disabilities, and on gender, and that was very important. Now, the 2030 Agenda is broad and ambitious. The targets are designed, I think, to make people think about how things are interconnected in the real world, which is helpful to support action for older persons because real challenges in real lives can be captured more accurately. For example, the links between employment and social protection, between environment and health, and between cities and access to services. The agenda is universal, covering all countries, but there's a further interpretation of universality that is even more relevant to discussions on aging and older persons. That is, governments have committed to leaving no one behind and to try to reach the furthest away first. This means, at the very least, that progress on the goals needs to be realized for all people, regardless of their age or other characteristics. This commitment to leaving no one behind, together with other commitments in the preamble, means the agenda is more explicitly aligned with human rights and therefore reflects the existing human rights declarations for children, disabled persons, indigenous people, and LGBT persons. Older persons are therefore in the agenda. Many of the targets are extremely relevant for older persons. On poverty, social protection, on health, on lifelong learning, on gender, on employment, on cities. But the slant of that inclusion, I think as we've heard, is still about protection and about older persons being vulnerable and needing additional support, and far less about older persons being strong agents themselves for sustainable development, about the contribution that older persons can and must make. And as we've heard already today, there is no specific human rights instrument for older persons. And I would posit that if there was, and that had existed before 2015, the commitments on aging and older persons in the 2030 Agenda would have been even stronger. Now, the question then becomes, how can we bring this together in an agenda that will carry us successfully on this journey to dignity and age equality? And so I wanted to finish with 7 steps, 7 actions, all of which will be familiar to you already, but taken together, I believe we could shift the dial on aging. And the first is we have to radically change our perspective. Old age is everyone's future. It's not to be ignored or feared. Older people are not just another group in the long, common list of the vulnerable, who therefore insist on extra protection and help. It needs to be flipped around. Older people bring skills, experience, and wisdom that can help to make better informed decisions, to stay calm in the face of turmoil and confrontation, and who show patience, compassion, and empathy. They're not a drain on resources that can be spent elsewhere. Their inclusion, economically, politically, socially, and in safeguarding nature, pays back. It's to everyone's benefit. The second is to consistently adopt a life course approach. We need to comprehensively and consistently do this for all policy issues, but I would say especially in terms of nutrition, health, education, and employment. As Ashton Applewhite told us in this building in July, we are either old or future old. The support we get at a young age and in youth and middle age prepares us for longer, healthier, higher quality, and enjoyable lives. Third, infrastructure and services. We need to invest more in age-friendly infrastructure and provide services that enable older persons to participate and contribute in our offices and other places of work, in our transport systems, in housing, and in education. 4, organisations and institutions. We need better age diversity in structures where decisions are made and resources allocated. In parliaments, governments, civil services, businesses big and small, NGOs, community organisations, so that older people's voices are heard, their opinions and needs are reflected, and better quality management is exercised. 5, consign age discrimination to the dustbin. This is a long process, a hard-fought cultural change, but we can underpin it by concretising the rights of older people in national and multilateral legal commitments, just as we have done for children, for migrants, and for people living with disabilities. Governments should expand their capacities to analyse and respond to a stronger agenda for older people. And given the seismic demographic shift faced eventually by all countries, we should also consider capacity and leadership at the multilateral level. Perhaps now is the time for a distinct UN office on ageing with the capacity for policy analysis, legal advice, and advocacy. 6, older women. We need to pay extra attention and dedicate more resources to the needs of older women as they make up the majority of older persons, especially the older old, and face additional overlapping challenges and constraints, including discrimination and violence. And lastly, on data and research. I say this, of course, coming from a research institute. We don't have very much information on the well-being of older persons in some parts of the world, especially those with fewer resources and less capacity. Many of the data collection instruments we rely on, household surveys, are effectively age-blind. We need to remove the age caps that exist in these instruments, and I would encourage all governments to support and participate in the Titchfield City Group on Ageing, which will be working until 2023 to assess gaps and make recommendations. But linked to this research, obviously we need standard continuing research on the well-being of older persons in contemporary situations in different parts of the world. But we also need future-oriented research on how the lives of older people will change in the next century because of our rapidly changing world, the environment, technology, changing patterns of inequality, and the shifting economic and political gravity between the global north and global south. Now, those 7 actions are easier said than done. It will take time and effort and persuasion and advocacy, but in the end, the world will listen, largely because the world itself will be older and wiser with more skills and experience to progress this agenda. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you for contextualizing aging with other demographic shifts and global megatrends. Thanks for clarifying the multiple dimensions of inequality. And thank you for spelling out the somewhat outdated construct of the older person inherent in the 2030 agenda. And also thank you for energizing the upcoming panel discussion with your 7 action points. I will now leave the floor to Andrew Scott, who will help us think differently. Andrew is our expert, not on aging, but on longevity. Andrew is a professor of economics at London Business School. As his biography shows, he has rich experience of both teaching, research, and policy advice. He did co-author the bestseller, The 100-Year Life, and he is a co-founder of the Longevity Forum. Andrew, the floor is yours.
Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you for being here, and thank you to the organizers for the invitation. It's a great pleasure to be here and join in your celebrations for older people. In fact, because I'm in a mood to celebrate, I'm going to celebrate a lot more than that. I also want to celebrate longevity, which, of course, is one of the reasons why we're here celebrating so many older people. What I find striking about longevity is how it's not the natural narrative for the discourse that we tend to have. Much debate is around an aging society, and I'm sure you're aware that around the world, every country is aging. And there are a number of different factors demographically behind that. The first is, of course, a change in the structure of the population. As countries tend to get richer, the birth rate falls, and so, as has already been commented, we have an extraordinary world where the first time ever in human history there are more people aged over 65 than under 5. If you think 65 is old, that means there's more old people than there are young. That's extraordinary. It must do something for the nature of society. But that change in the structure of the population gets a lot of demographic focus, but I want to focus on something else, which is a fact that, on average, we're living longer lives across the world. And the gains in life expectancy have been truly tremendous. At first, making huge improvements in infant mortality, then increasingly making improvements in middle-age mortality, and now also making inroads into the mortality rates of older individuals. My own country has added 36 years of life over the last 110 years. That's an extraordinary achievement, and one that I do not understand why we do not celebrate much more. And what, of course, is even more extraordinary is the majority of those extra years of life are healthy years of life. And I got into this area as an economist because I couldn't quite understand how the negativity of an aging society could be the conclusion of a result that said, on average, around the world, people are living longer and are healthier for longer. That, to me, sounds really good news individually, it sounds great news socially, and it should be good news economically. This is the chart that, in particular, I find quite striking. This is best practice life expectancy. This is not the oldest person ever alive at any point in time. This just looks at the country with the highest average life expectancy at any point in time. It's a chart produced by Jim Vorpal. And it shows you this extraordinary increase over the last 100 years in best practice life expectancy. In every decade, life expectancy is increased by 2 or 3 years. But we kind of don't notice that. We talk about technology and how it's changing the world around us, but this sort of says that, on average, every generation is living perhaps a decade longer than the previous one. That has big implications for how we live our life and how we think about our future. It also means that at every age, everyone has more future compared to the past, and that doesn't seem to be well captured by the notion of an aging society. This chart, I think, also gets to grips with some of the challenges we face around an aging society. The first is we discovered in the 20th century, to a degree that we never thought possible as humans, that age is malleable. We can affect how we age and how long we live. And that, of course, is why we've made such extraordinary progress globally in raising life expectancy. But that malleability of age brings about challenges. And one of them comes across from here, because if you extrapolate this trend, You get people being born today in countries such as Japan and even the UK with a plausible possibility of living to 100. That's a lot of time. How do we structure time to make the most of it? In the 20th century, we created the weekend. Time is a social convention. And as we live these longer lives, we need to think about how we redesign the life course. But the other challenge this brings about, of course, is ageism. Because we've shifted in the last 100 years to a world where we tend to measure age chronologically. For most of human history, people when they were born people didn't know how old they were or even when their birthday was. It was only as government started to keep accurate birth records that we started to get more and more legislation based around chronological age. And that, I think, is at the heart of so many of the challenges of why we think an aging society is a problem and why we encounter ageism. It's a retrograde step to think about age as a chronological phenomenon. I said that if this trend continues, we see people living to 100. This actually is the proportion of people you can see there living over 100 is the fastest growing age category in the world. As Mark Friedman, the chairman of Encore, says in the US, the only resource the world isn't running out of is older people. How do we exploit that opportunity that brings? Now, when I look at the demographic literature, they tend to focus on changes in the structure of the population and how there are more old people. What I like about my focus on longevity is I want to think about much more the second channel, which is there are changes in how we're aging. And that, I think, is how society has to adapt to make sure we seize the opportunities of an aging society and not the disadvantages. That first channel, changes in the structure of the population. As the birth rate declines, you see more old people. The strength of that channel varies from countries to country. Countries like China, where the birth rate has fallen very sharply, are seeing very dramatic changes in the proportion of old people. But much more focus has to be given to that second channel to ensure that all of us age as well as possible and are supported as best as possible right the way through the course of life. If age is malleable, we need to focus less on the number of old people and more on focusing on to make sure as many people as possible live as long as possible, as healthily as possible, and in as fulfilled way as possible. We have a chronological sense of age. But if age is malleable, that's a problem. Because chronological age never changes. A year is a year. Someone who is 70 is always 70. But there's much more meaningful concepts of age. There is your biological age, your health and your fitness. Your subjective age, how old do you feel? And then, of course, your sociological age. What does society think you should be doing? But an obsession with chronological age gets in the way of adapting to this malleability that we are discovering, that we are changing and aging in different ways, and we need to exploit that channel more. Very little of this malleability of age is based around an individual's genetics. The estimates suggest about 25% of how you age is genetic. The rest can be responded to by individual behavior, policy, and the environment. Demography says the population is aging. The age being malleable gives us a great deal of freedom to make sure we can exploit this and make the most of it. 75% of how we age seems to be influenced by our behaviors and our environment. Wow, surely that's the world's biggest policy opportunity and policy challenge. Now, that malleability of age also, of course, leads to diversity. Because as life gets longer, as we see more and more old people, that diversity of how we age is going to get ever greater. Hence the importance of making sure we leave no one behind. We're also going to see more and more policy focus on influencing how we age. We need, of course, to change how we think about being old. I'd also even challenge whether we really are seeing society aging, and I'll show you some charts later to back that up. But above all, we need to start thinking about rewiring the life course, because these longer lives require us to do things differently at every age. And that's distinct from the concept of an aging society. Now, what I think is interesting about this malleability of age is whilst an aging society seems to be a single topic, there is no one single silver bullet. there is a raft of issues that make age malleable. This also, I think, creates some challenges around a policy agenda about aging. Because if the secret of aging is greater diversity, then identifying a single set of causes that represents this group becomes more and more challenging. We have to recognize that the over 65s, or whatever boundary you want to put in place to focus on, are as diverse, if not more diverse, than the under 65s. In other words, people are people. I said earlier about trying to rewire the life course. So in my book, The 100-Year Life, that's a little bit what I thought about trying to do. I said earlier we created the concept of a weekend in the 20th century. We also invented some new stages of life. America invented the teenager. For most of human history, teenagers didn't exist. You were either a child or an adult. We also, increasingly in many countries, invented the concept of retirement. And as life continues to get longer, we need to think about changing the course of life and introducing whole new stages. That affects everything. It affects how we think about our relationships, when we have children, when we get married. It affects when we start thinking about our education and when to begin it or when to end. And of course, it affects our working career. Because the three-stage life that emerged in the 20th century of education, work, and retirement cannot be stretched to deal with the type of life expectancy that we expect today from many children born around the world. We need to do things differently. We need, in the words of Laura Carstenston, a new map of life. And that's a global challenge. It isn't just something that affects the richest countries. Everywhere around the world, we're seeing expected length of life increase, and we're seeing a change in the age distribution of society. That involves some fundamental challenges, particularly aimed at making the most of the malleability of age. We need to think not just about financial assets and how people save for retirement or how they save for old age. We also think about productive assets and how people maintain their sense of engagement and performance throughout their life. Education is going to have to become much more like health. If I told you 30 years ago I got a degree in economics, that's an answer to a question about my education. If I told you 30 years ago I ran a marathon, that's not an answer to how healthy I am. But we need to shift our concept of education to think of it like health. It's something that at all ages we need to be able to access and tap into if we're to navigate through these longer lives. And then finally, there's your vitality assets, your mental and physical health, and your friendships and your relationships. We need to think throughout life how to support and how to maintain them. And certainly in my own country, the way we have a career is not a good way of supporting those vitality assets. We're going to have to see good ways and changing of how we work and get corporates to allow us to have much more flexible work where we can ramp up and ramp down our hours and where we have a sense of recruitment at all ages and not just at the beginning of a career path. And then, of course, right at the end, there's a final asset I would stress that is important, which is transitional assets, your ability to deal with change. As life lengthens, you will go through more changes. If there is a wisdom in old age, I think it's about seeing these changes and how your ego and your identity is continuous throughout that process. But how do we support people through these changes? Because if we look at diversity and vulnerability, in different countries at different points in time, there are key moments where we need to support and make sure that good transitions and not bad transitions occur. I ran a conference last week with the Rockefeller Foundation in Stanford looking at these global longevity issues. And whether it be in the 20s in Africa or the 50s in my own country, there are certain moments where you need to focus to ensure that healthy aging is achieved and the transition to a next stage is successful. So, we have a huge agenda because both at the individual and the social level, there are things that need to be done to affect how we age. We need to ensure as many people as possible live as long as possible, and we need to focus on securing longevity and not just supporting an aging society. There have been plenty of calls today to think about life differently, and I want to offer up these charts, the ones I'm familiar with from the UK. The one on the left shows you, the blue line shows the average age of the UK society. It's increasing. The average Brit has never been older. The red line, however, shows you the average mortality rate. That's a measure of how long left you have to live. And what this says is the average Brit has never been older, but never had so long left to live. That doesn't seem to me to be about an aging society. That seems to me about everyone being more forward-looking and thinking about their future in a different way. And really what these longer lives are about time. If you ignore the first 20 years of life, and ignore the last 10 years of life, and I'll give you a weekend and some time off in the evenings, and I'm going to call everything else productive hours. And I don't mean necessarily working for money. I just mean, well, you could be doing something, engaged in something. If you have a life expectancy of 100, you have 100,000 more hours than a life expectancy of 70. So the question, ladies and gentlemen, is what do you want to do with that extra 100,000 hours? Some of it's going to have to be about work, but not all of it. And just extending our current patterns of life seems to me the wrong way of doing it. I said earlier that best practice life expectancy has increased by 2 or 3 years every decade. That's a bit like me saying at the end of the day's gone from 24 to 32 hours. If we had a 32-hour day, we'd structure it very differently. At least I would. I'd get up much earlier in the morning, and I'd go to bed much later. And I'd have a wonderful sleep in the middle of the day. And I wouldn't have 3 meals. I had 5, hopefully smaller ones, or I'd never reach 100 years of life. And I might call them still breakfast, lunch, and dinner, but introduce 2 new words. And, of course, what was lunch will now become something different. In other words, we'd restructure time. And that, of course, is what we need to do in response to the growing life expectancy around the world. This is why I think many younger people are getting married later and having children later. When life is longer, you don't make commitments so early. We have an opportunity to redistribute time across our life to improve life at all ages, to ease some of the trade-offs and pressures that occur at each point in time. And above all, we have to encourage everyone of every age to recognize that with more future, they need to be more forward-looking and more investing in their future. And that's not just about finances. It's about education. It's about relationships. It's about community. All of these things affect how you age. All of them affect the quality of your life. So as has been pointed out, this isn't about the end of life. The increase in life expectancy is not coming about all at the end. In fact, to some degree, it's coming about at the end of middle age. But this is something that affects all of life, and not just to make sure that when we're young, we take actions that ensure we're healthier when we're old. We've got to enjoy being young just for being young, just as we have to enjoy being old just for being old. But we have to recognize that the life course has interconnectivities, and we have new opportunities about doing things. Let me just come back to some of the ideas about changing our mindset. Chronological age is a really limiting perspective. Those of you who are familiar with old age dependency ratios, if you measure age chronologically, you will never notice that how we're aging is changing, because you will only notice there are more people aged over 65. So that chronological focus on age misses the greatest human achievement of the 20th century, that we've made age malleable. We don't have the tools or instruments to capture those effects. And without the instruments to measure it, we lack the policy to focus on bringing about even better changes in how we age. In some sense, it's not that there's an aging society, but if we are aging better biologically, we are younger for longer. I gave that example of the UK being a case in point. So let me just try and conclude. Around the world, more people are living for longer. This is one of humanity's greatest achievements. That's why it's good that we're here to celebrate the International Day of Older People. The reason behind this is that we discovered that age is malleable. Across the world, we've managed to make more people live longer and healthier on average. The question is, how do we really exploit that lever and celebrate this as an achievement? As I've tried to point out, it's about time. And time means that this is not just about older people, it's also about the young and what we do throughout the life. One of the biggest challenges of all is that the malleability of age means that there is considerable diversity. I'm not sure older people are necessarily wiser than younger people. Some are, some aren't. We have to be very careful that we don't just accept and reject negative and positive stereotypes. What we have to focus on is that there's a wide range of diversity amongst older individuals. They have human rights like everyone else, and recognizing those human rights means thinking about their individual needs and the sheer scale and diversity that that involves. An aging society is one of our greatest achievements, and so it seems only right to celebrate and make the most of it. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Dr. Scott. Did we not promise transformative thinking today? I think we'll nickname you our longevity guru for the UN. And for those of you who haven't yet read The 100-Year Life, I highly recommend it. You get it, you pass it on to your children, your grandchildren. It is very important that we begin to rethink time. Now, as we're going to watch a short video, courtesy of AARP, I'm going to invite the panelists and the moderator and our next speaker to come forward while that video is playing, so we'll be ready to move on with the program right after that. So now, the video.
The pace of change and the demand to adjust and adapt are increasing. A new approach to the future of work is required, one that is multi-generational. Investing in a workforce inclusive of all expands prosperity for all. Businesses reap stronger financial returns, employee satisfaction grows, consumers access more life-changing products and services, in sync with their evolving needs. We know an age-diverse workforce is strong and more engaged. The research is clear. Productivity is highest when generations work side by side. Diverse teams drive better financial returns. Mixed-age teams outperform teams of similar ages. Translation: age diversity is good for business. And as the world's population ages, businesses with experienced workers are better equipped to tap the $7.6 trillion in annual economic activity generated by people over 50 in the US alone. This longevity economy is now larger than that of any country except the United States and China. National Seniors Australia estimates that total household spending among older age groups in their country will grow from $4 billion in 2016 to $11 billion in 2035. And they find that if they can increase the labour force participation of people over 50 by 10%, it will add $16 million in spending to their economy. Industry leaders recognize that a growing older population is a key driver of economic growth, innovation, and value creation. AARP sees the need and opportunity for action. That's why we work with international institutions like the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, World Economic Forum, and the UN to identify best practices and economic incentives for a multi-generational workforce. We are calling on industry leaders to build age diversity into their strategic vision, training and hiring practices. AARP founder Dr. Ethel Percy Andrews paved the way 60 years ago with this kind of thinking when she said, "Today we find in the world about us great issues at stake. For any age, never has there been a greater opportunity, a greater responsibility, a more awesome obligation." The five-generation workplace is an emerging reality. We can't change the demographic trends, but we can change how we respond to them. The time is now. Join us.
RP for that, and for those of you who are familiar with Erica Dar, she is the narrator on that video, and she did a beautiful job. Thank you, Erica, and thank you, AARP. Dr. Jane Barrett is serving as our moderator for the rest of today's program. She is the Secretary General of the International Federation on Aging. Among her many positions, she is a member of the International Council for Adult Immunizations. And the IFA, along with DESA and the NGO Committee on Aging, are sponsoring a side event tomorrow. The topic is End Immunization Inequality Toward Healthy Aging. Everyone can join it by live webcast tomorrow or here at the UN at 1:15 in Conference Room 11. And as one of IFA's UN representatives, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Jane Barrett.
Dear friends and colleagues, it's a joy to be with you this morning and to have the honour of moderating this very thoughtful panel. But before I introduce our panellists to you, it's my great pleasure to ask Carolyn Schmidt to come to the podium and give us a brief summary. The podium, Carolyn? Okay. That's great. To give us a brief report, a DESA report on World Population Ageing 2019 highlights. Carolyn, we're going to just talk a little bit about you and who you are. So just hold there. Carolyn is the Chief of Fertility and Population Ageing Section in the Population Division of UN DESA. She started her career in the United Nations system in the 90s and has held various positions serving in different duty stations. And I tell you this because I think it's really fascinating the journeys that each of us travel in our lifetime and the experience and expertise that we carry with us into the future. You know, Carolyn has worked in Albania, New York, Trinidad, Tobago. She's also supported the development of MISA in Uganda and Kenya in collaboration with Malawi. Today, she's currently a member of the steering committee of the Titchfield City Group. You know, such an important group when it comes to talking about older people on ageing and age disaggregated data, which aims to contribute to the establishment of international standards and methods for the compilation of statistics and data on the major dimensions of ageing. Please welcome Carolyn Schmidt.
Do you get my presentation? Okay. Well, I would like to thank you all. I would like to thank the organizers. I would like to thank everybody in the room for being here, for celebrating with us the International Day of Older Persons. I also would like to thank Jane for the lovely introduction. It's now a bit challenging after I think we had a very interesting introductional speeches, and especially Andrew, who really set the stage to rethink aging. So for me now, as a demographer, to introduce our report, I think we have to look at demographics not as a contradiction, but really an enrichment of the discussions. I don't want to be here and, to say, there's an antagonism, but I think we really complement each other, and the more we know from different dimensions of aging, the better for all of us. So I would like to start. What I really want to do here is to introduce, every 2 years we produce the World Population on Aging that is based on our World Population Prospects that are released every 2 years, and that work has already been cited by different speakers before me, so I don't want to go into it. But what we do in this report, and also we have fertility report, migration report, mortality, where we draw on global data to really provide an overview of global trends on different aspects. So the big report on aging is currently being finalized, but every 2 years we are also releasing a highlight that really presents the key findings and also in a kind of easy, digestible way. So I have a couple of copies here, and that I can distribute. It will also be available soon on the internet. Let's go. The topics discussed are global aging, regional trends, measures of population aging. We also look into national transfer accounts and end with some policy recommendations. Global and regional trends of population aging, I don't want to spend too much time because the previous speakers have already addressed the key trends, but I'm just providing maybe a different way of presenting it, that we really see where are most of the older persons living right now, and we see the majority, 37%, right now lives in Central and Southern Asia, and we expect that trend to continue well into the 2050s. We also see Europe and Northern America holding considerable large shares of persons over age 65, and that will also continue. The speed of aging is fastest in Eastern and Southern and Southeastern Asia. We see most of the countries that have the largest percentage point increase in the share of older persons are in Asia. That is the dark blue color in Eastern and Southern Asian Asia. Measures of population aging. I'm going to go quickly, very quickly, of the famous old age dependency ratio. I know it is a number we have used, and it has a long history. It goes back on economic development, really looking on how populations can be supported, who is dependent and who is producing. So that is something that was then introduced by our first director of the population division into the work of the division, so we have continued doing it. We're also producing support ratio that is pretty much the inverse of the dependency ratio, and we know they're going up, so that is no news, but the trends are continuing. But we are also now taking into consideration other measures, since we know life expectancy is going up, and Andrew has really focused his talk on that matter. So we are also now using more measures introduced by YASA, Sergei Sherbov and Warren Sanders. Some of you might know that work. So where we look at prospective aging measurements, where we not look at chronological age and set a fixed aging threshold at 60, 65, 70, but we look at remaining life expectancy. So I don't want to go into more technical details. The report, the bigger report and technical papers will provide you with more information. But what we really see is, in comparison to the previous trends, and we look at prospective measures, the trends of aging are very different. So aging is no longer as fast, as threatening as some people would say than it is when we go and look at the conventional aging measurements. What we also have now, we have the UN, our division has started many years ago to look into national transfer accounts. And this report now really highlights, I decided at some point, I don't want to just repeat what we have also done. And in the division, we always have looked at additional aspects apart from the standards measures, where we really present an overview, a global overview of trends. So we are now digging in more into national transfer accounts, where we can really see how is old age financed. And I give you just a few examples where we look, national transfer accounts look at all ages. Our focus is now on older age groups, but we also look at younger age groups, people in the middle ages, so it's really a life cycle approach. So an example is, for example, the Philippines for Asia, that is very much an asset-based economy for older persons, where really older persons mainly finance their livelihoods through own assets. We look at Australia, where we definitely see more public transfers. The same is for Korea, Germany, Costa Rica. Korea, we also see the role of family transfers is important. What we also see is, maybe you don't see it from the back, are the negatives, where we say, where national transfer accounts find that older persons actually contribute. So I think it really feeds into the discussion that older persons are not only dependents who draw on resources, but we see, and if you look in detail in the different countries for which data are available, that we can definitely see older persons also transfer to the state, to the families, and through own work and through assets they have. I tried to race through my presentation in 7 minutes. I really hope I could whet your appetite, that you are interested to look at our document that really provides a global overview and gives you food for thought, and hopefully we can complement and add to the discussion on population aging. That is to be continued. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Carolyn. And can I encourage all those interested, and even those that are not interested in this field, to get hold of that document. And the International Federation on Ageing stands tall and says that we will put the link on our website, and I encourage all civil society to do the same. Because the data that is being collected and analysed and interpreted is critical to our discussions with member states around the rights and protection of older people. So, this is a wonderful source of material. It's now my great pleasure to provide you a little bit of an insight as to the format of this afternoon, and that is that each thoughtful panellist will have 7 minutes. And we have a timekeeper on the floor, and there'll be consequences if they go over 7 minutes. Because the richness of these events is the conversations, the questions that come from the floor. So I encourage you to come up with questions, and I encourage the panellists to stay to time. Before I open the session and introduce our first speaker, I do want to formally acknowledge a person in the room, and that's Amal Rafi. Amal is the Chief of the Program on Ageing Unit. Now, most of you would know Amal. Her leadership, her commitment, her persuasiveness, and with great humour, her ability to bring on board unlikely champions in this whole field of ageing is remarkable. And we need unlikely champions, because we've been talking to the likely champions for decades, and that hasn't changed anything. And so, her persuasiveness, if you haven't ever met Amal, don't say that you'll do something, because she will hold you to it. But we thank you, Amal, for your leadership, because it's through your leadership that we become a more cohesive and coherent body of voices around the world, and we thank you for that. The journey to age inequality can only be achieved by promoting the social, economic and political inclusion of older people. And just yesterday I posted an image on LinkedIn, and the image had this text. This is Jimmy. Jimmy is 95 years of age. Jimmy had brain cancer in 2015. Jimmy broke his hip in 2019. Jimmy fell at home on Sunday and had 14 stitches in his head. And Jimmy showed up on Monday to help build houses for Habitat for Humanity. Now, what struck me as really remarkable is that less than 24 hours and there's been nearly 8,000 likes of that image. And I tried to work out, what is it? Is it because it's a known person? And yes, it may be. But it's something more than that. It's something about standing up for older people and knowing those older people are resilient and courageous and authentic and have integrity. And so when we listen to the panellists today, about their insights into the journey that older people are not only starting but will be continuing across the next decades, let's think about not the burden, because there is nothing burdensome in getting up on a Monday morning and helping another person build a house. And around the world today, there are millions of older people, may not be building houses, but they're taking care of grandchildren. they're actually doing what they want to do. They may be working. You know, they may be just living in the community and doing what they want to do. We must start taking age out of the conversation in the celebration of older people and their journey. So let us think about that as we go forward. It's my great pleasure, first and foremost, to introduce Vinicius Pinheiro. Mr. Pinheiro is a special representative to the United Nations and director of the International Labour Organization office in New York. He often represents the ILO in UN discussions related to the post-2015 development agenda, including social protection, youth employment and migration. What was interesting to me, Mr. Pinheiro, was that you were part of the ILO Sherpa G20 team and acted as Executive Secretary of the Social Protection Floor Advisory Group. He's also worked in the OECD in Paris, Inter-American Development Bank, and to the World Bank for projects in Africa and Latin America. Please welcome Mr. Vinicius Pinheiro.
Thank you so much, Madam Moderator. Thank you so much for the organizers for inviting the International Labour Organization to this important day. As you know, the ILO is celebrating its 100 years old, so we have aged in a very wiser, in a very effective way, and we are, after 100 years old, we are more relevant than ever. In one of these events that we organized to mark the centenary of the ILO, the moderator asked the following question to the ILO Director General. So what is the secret for longevity? How can you survive 100 years of struggle when the world changes so much? And then he said something that is very meaningful for our debate. First, of course, we're talking about a relevant issue. So employment is as relevant now as it was in 1919. In 1919, of course, the connection with employment and peace was so important after the First World War. But now, I mean, it's clearly an important pillar of social stability, including in the aging process. The second is because we are value-based organization. So we define norms and standards, including for related to aging, related to social security, and related to occupational safety and health, and to all aspects of the world of work. And these norms and standards, they are adopted by countries, they become law. So there is this connection, there is this usefulness of the debate as well. Third, because of our tripartite nature, we bring together not only governments but also workers and employers. And that is something that the Secretary General says the ILO has a finger in the pulse of the society, because we feel changes, and this helps us in adapting, in updating and adapting our capacity to interact. And that happened in many occasions in our history. As I said in the beginning, we were connected to peace. After the Second World War, ILO was very instrumental in building the welfare states in many countries. After when globalization started to be questioned, we came up with this social dimension of globalization declaration that said something about we need to distribute the gains of globalization. And finally, this is the point I'd like to make here in the 7 minutes. We just came up with a new declaration that marks the centenary of the organization, which is the Future of Work Declaration. So this declaration, which will shape the work of the ILO for the coming years, has important components that connect with the discussion that we're having today. In particular, it calls for supporting measures that will help all older workers to expand their choices, optimize their opportunities to work in good quality jobs, productive and healthy conditions, and to enable active aging. So this is a very important element that actually speaks to some of the issues that were addressed this morning in terms of activating the old age, the aging process. But again, under choices, opportunities, productive, and healthy conditions. So it's not that everybody should be obliged to be activated, but there should be a choice and the access to this to happen. The second point that the declaration brings, which is quite important, is this connection with adequate and sustainable social protection systems. So basically, as you know, one of the conditions for health aging is precisely income security. Now, so it's very important to, I mean, there was a big progress in terms of extending old age pensions over the last 20 years, but there's still a lot of gaps. So basically, just around 1/4 of the working population, 25%, is contributing to a pension scheme. And in some regions, you know, the coverage of old age pensions is really, really high. In particular, Northern Africa is sub-Saharan, which is like the coverage is very low. Now is below 20%. So more needs to be done on regional basis. But the importance is the important thing is this connection between active aging and active employment policies in social protection is super important to factor the models that we will have in the future. The third point I'd like to make relates to lifelong learning. And as you know, in this new world that is coming up, so the boundaries between education, work, and retirement are becoming more and more flexible. So that means, the same way that we need to keep learning while we're working, we also need to keep learning and perhaps keep working while we're retired. So this is a world that we need flexible parameters, and again, based on choice, based on opportunities, based on healthful conditions that individuals can operate. And this is a very important point of the declaration as well. The connection with adequate occupational and safe occupational conditions is so important. If you are asking for active aging or for activation of old age workers or older workers, we need to offer the necessary, to change the work environment, you offer the necessary guarantees and systems and to produce healthy work environments. And finally, the declaration also talks about the change in the working arrangements. So basically, it's unlocking productive capacity in many cases, but it brings also some flexible working conditions that could be more appropriated or could be customized to specific age tracks. So these 5 points, I think, are quite important as we are placing this debate according to the new challenges, both related to demography, which was quite explored here today, but also with climate change and also with technology. And the technology, of course, can be an enabler to unlock labor force participation, in particular for older workers. The last point I'd like to make, and I have 1 minute that I know, is that this debate, of course, the human rights dimension is super important, it's the pillar of everything we're saying, but this goes beyond the human rights. Now, this is about economy, it's about politics, it's about social issues as well. And this needs to be factored in the debate. So we heard a lot, of course, we need to do this because it's a human right. Of course it is. But there's a need for more studies and more, let's say, coalitions and to explore the economic advantages, and the social and political advantages of including, old age people in the different systems. So this is a message I'd like to leave you. I think it would be important, in particular, to build coalitions and alliances that could foster this type of new approaches to deal with this issue. Thank you so much, Madam Chair.
Intervention, starting off by saying that the ILO is more relevant now than what it was 100 years ago. And perhaps we could suggest that older people may be more relevant now than what they were many years ago. But pulling on those last points, economy, politics and social issues, and then within the framework of environment, you measured the healthy environment a number of times. And for older people to remain in the workforce and to be volunteers and to be part of community, then the health conditions, the social conditions of environment are going to be critically important. I also enjoyed hearing the fact that building coalitions, and I would hope across sectors and across disciplines, is going to be critically important. So thank you very much for leading off the discussion. We now turn to Elizabeth Esel. Elizabeth is the founder and CEO of the Global Institute for Experienced Entrepreneurship, an organisation dedicated to empowering cross-generational entrepreneurial experience by working with individuals of all ages in close relation with private business, NGOs and governments. Elizabeth is also one of those trusted advisors, and we all like to have those people, don't we? Because they come to the table with experience but views that can inform the development of each other's work. Elizabeth has been an advisor for various entities, including the White House, the Obama White House, US Congress, the Clinton Global Initiative, the EU Commission on Entrepreneurship, the Federal Reserve, the UN, the Gerontological Society, and global firms. I, for one, would like Elizabeth on my team, wouldn't you? So let's listen to Elizabeth's thoughts about this journey that older people, systemically and individually, are on today. Thank you, Elizabeth.
Thank you for that introduction. I am delighted to be here, and as some of you already know, I'm always thrilled to talk about the positive aspects of aging, and I have a lot to say in 7 minutes, so I apologize in advance. We're going to be going through these at warp speed. Please see me afterwards if you have any questions, and you can also email me, and I'm sure the slides will be available. We are all about empowering experience, and it is the world's largest untapped natural resource, and it's growing. We like to say, beware knights in shining armor. Everybody in society thinks about the shiny, new, bright, young thing. But remember, they've never had their metal tested. We talk about longevity in terms of potential, and as some of my colleagues who are also in Bangkok have already said, Sergei Sherbov brought this up, and it really made a profound impact on that session and all of my discussions about aging. We like to think of this as a silver economy. Some people say silver tsunami, but we like to debunk that. Experience is a currency in today's global economy. Experience is our accumulated facts and knowledge. It's knowing what works and what doesn't. It's a competitive advantage. And the older and bolder we get, we become new economic engines. And I'd like to show you some of the ways how. Basic economics, I call it, which we also have heard today. In terms of new business startups, highest rate of entrepreneurship worldwide has shifted to the 55 to 64-year-old age group. Entrepreneurial activity among the 50s increased by more than 50% since 2008. 60-year-old startup is 3 times as likely as a 30-year-old founder's startup to launch successfully. 5 years after startup, and this is really significant and again attributed to their experience, 70% of ventures established by 50 plus are still in operation compared to just 28% of enterprises launched by younger entrepreneurs. And people talk about the gig economy, but recent research, very recent research, documents that 50-plus entrepreneurs are 2 to 3 times more likely to form a new business, which benefits everyone, than just being involved in the gig economy. More basic economics we talk about are entrepreneuring in the workplace. And you'll hear me use this word entrepreneuring because we've never had this longevity. So we have to think entrepreneurially about it, whether we're starting a business or in the workplace or just trying to live a life that we like. Increase of 7% of people 55 plus in Australia would increase the GDP by $25 billion. In the UK, if the employment rate of 50 to 60-year-olds equaled the younger demographic, the economy would be boosted by 88 billion pounds. For every euro the Spanish government invests in to counter the negative effect of the retirement syndrome, receives 129 euros in return. First, I thought that was an error and I wasn't understanding. I don't speak Spanish. The woman finally sent me the research after trying to convey this to me, and it's an astounding statistic. Entrepreneuring never gets old. Entrepreneur can be anyone, anytime, anywhere. And to put a face on some of these entrepreneurs, this woman who lives in rural Wisconsin, Jill Curtula, is an entrepreneur, though she doesn't identify herself as such. She started her own business after being laid off from a technology company, and she really takes sweaters and repurposes them and sells them as designer sweaters over the internet. She said, I'm not really an entrepreneur in terms of boosting the economy. I said, well, where do you get your supplies? How do you mail your supplies? How do you package them? She is, in essence, a supply chain. Barbara Beskind is one of my favorite examples. So we go from rural Wisconsin to Silicon Valley, where Barbara Beskind finally achieved her dream as being a tech designer for IDEO in Silicon Valley at age 91. She got the job because she, in her late 80s, called the president of IDEO, who was advertising that they're creating all these wonderful products for seniors. And she called him and said, have you ever asked us what we want? And so he brought her in as an advisor, and now she is designing for the company, and she's also working with the younger designers. And we talk about cross-generational experience, because we've got to eliminate these silos and start collaborating. We don't stop playing because we get old. We get old because we stop playing. I love this quote from George Bernard Shaw. And it's time to play with our ideas and actionable solutions. And this is my work with the Federal Reserve Bank in their growing rural economic development programs. We've got to create more community cross-sector ecosystems. Entrepreneurial mindset we have to reinforce, build community brain trusts, intergenerational innovation spaces, and experience incubators and training programs. We have to take ideas into action and set priorities, figure out what's next, what you can do, and what will hold you back. And as I said in the beginning, silver economy or silver tsunami, the choice is yours, and please act today. Thank you.
It's quite clear that through Elizabeth's presentation, it's an inspiration. It's an inspiration not only to hear what Elizabeth's doing, but I think more importantly, putting faces to people in the community. And I think one question for you later on, Elizabeth, is really going to be around the language that keeps perpetuating stereotypes in our community. You know, there's nothing more frustrating than seeing the word tsunami or hearing a keynote presenter saying the silver tsunami is coming. Because it really feels to me as though I'm going to sort of see millions of older people come over a hill one day. And yet that's not the case. You know, let us stand up for new language, you know, language that really represents the unique nature, characteristics and roles of older people. So I'd also like your views later on, Elizabeth, about how do we build the case for the return on investment? Because that's really what we need to be thinking about. Case studies are one thing, but how can we use this opportunity in creating the narrative that actually talks about the actual contribution to a nation's economy with choice across generations. So thank you. We now welcome a good friend from Nepal, Krishna Gautam. Krishna, and let me just step back. So we've had Vinicius from the ILO. We've had Elizabeth, you know, that really has been a bridge, you know, across generations, but government and NGO and private sector. And now we have someone that really founded an organisation and works on the ground. Because we've often talked about this bottom-up approach and the top-down. Well, Krishna actually makes the connection. So Krishna is the director of a local NGO, Aging Nepal. Krishna has worked in India, Nepal, and and China, focusing in rural development programs, projects supported by development agencies such as the World Bank and UNDP. It's only been 2011 when you founded Nepal. You've done a lot of work in a short period of time. Since starting Aging Nepal in 2011, you've authored over 7 books and booklets on ageing, all published in your language, which is really critically important, isn't it? Additionally, Aging Nepal has been conducting successful literacy classes for older adults for the past few years. Krishna is well known in civil society as that person that steps up and contributes and informs and shares his story, but also the story of many people that he's connected with. So please welcome Krishna Gautam.
Thank you, Jane, for this very fabulous introduction. Good morning, everybody. And thank you, Your Excellencies and distinguished guests, for taking your time to be here. At first, I would like to express my sincere thanks to UN Committee on Aging, New York, for enabling me to be here with you today. I will try to share with you our experiences of implementing basic literacy for older persons in Nepal as we practice it and the results we get. Oh, I don't see any.
Next one, go forward.
Okay, thank you. Can I do it?
With pleasure.
60 years back in Nepal, that's my country, that's where I come, there were not as many schools. Child marriage was social norm and girls' education was stigmatized. These are few of the reasons why we have so high proportion of illiterate older women today in a society that is facing fast urbanization and new technologies are encroaching our life, our daily life, leaving older illiterates behind. The present-day civilization and development process are so designed and managed that illiterates get very little opportunities to participate in our development process. We have made our society so difficult for an illiterate to live a normal life as you take literacy for granted. Realizing this, it was 2016 when UN Committee on Aging in New York and Virginia Hazard Legacy Fund piloted a literacy program in Nepal, Togo, Mali, and Mozambique. It was also the first time for us to get surprised that more than 95% of older women of Nepal are illiterates today. We started with a search for a community with likely high concentration of illiterate older adults, a community undergoing fast urbanization with bulging migrants from rural area was selected. A local social organization was contacted through which we could reach out to families in the communities and select about 30 students and also 2 teachers from the same community. Running a class for older illiterates is so new a concept in our society that it took some efforts for convincing older illiterates and their families to join our class. As expected, we got 28 illiterate older women and only 4 men fitting our criteria. Criteria were totally illiterate, willing and able to come to class, and possibility of mobilizing them in other social development activities in the future. Even these 4 men dropped after first week, feeling uneasy about being in minority in the class. That's men. But after a week of running the class, we faced floods of older women coming to join our class, and we had to stop them because we had other space and other limitations. Our earlier plans to run the class for 4 hours a day had to be reduced to 2.5 hours a day to allow for their household responsibilities. And here we say older people don't work. The class enabled them to read and write short, simple statements. This helped them to fight loneliness, enhance self-respect, and we expect extended sense of belonging. Their literacy gave them access to new technologies like mobiles, broke the misconception that older people need not and cannot learn new things, create a new social resource that can be mobilized for different social development activities. Recently, we took a short survey of our new learners to assess the impact and found that they are more often included in family discussions after they became literate. They are treated more respectfully in families and community. Neighbors are more welcoming for casual talk, and grandchildren started feeling more comfortable to do homework in the presence of grandma. The main criteria we took as indicator of a success is continuation of the program by the concerned local government below municipality on their own after Aging Nepal completed its first program for the 8 to 10 months. It is higher the government, difficult to convince. I'm happy to inform you that all 5 classes we started are now being continued by their respective local governments with some technical support from Aging Nepal. High illiteracy among girls in rural Nepal is more common even today. This leaves immense scope and immense need to implement literacy for older person programs at the national level for quite some time to come. Right to education for all is included in Nepal's constitution, but left out in policies and programs and budgeting. We need to increase the number and coverage of our programs so that government get convinced and feel pressure to make it a part of national education system. I believe, and the government supports, that a UN Convention for the Rights of Older People can ensure lifelong learning opportunities for us all and our children when they get old. Thank you very much. Oh, I put up these, I hope it goes beyond 7, but this is the case study where a lady could not make her own phone call and had to wait for the children to come back home, her grandchildren to come home and make phone calls for her. So now she's more free. She can call.
I call that groundbreaking, don't you? Absolutely. Congratulations. Krishna, just one question before we go on to our last speaker. What was the cost of that pilot project?
One pilot project costed, class lasts from 8 to 10 months in a year. It's year round. Cost around 10. We started with less, but now it costs, depending on the place where we conduct the class, around 10,000 is the ballpark, I would say, dollar.
So 10,000 US?
Yes.
Okay.
10 months, 1,000 a month.
You know, just think about the return on investment and the impact that this improved literacy has made for the person, but also their family.
Yep. And the grandchildren, they don't have to shy away from their grandmother. Oh, she's illiterate, she doesn't know, so why should I sit with her and do my homework? I am illiterate when I go to other room.
So, no. Groundbreaking. Please join with me in thanking Krishna again. Before I introduce our last and final speaker, could I just encourage you to write some questions on some cards? And raise your hand if you've got a question, because I'm sure... Yep. So Cynthia's saying, please write a question and that they will be picked up around so that we can have a fairly robust discussion. Alana Officer, what can we say? Alana has held the position of Senior Health Advisor in the Department of Ageing and Life course of the World Health Organization since 2014. And as you probably, many of you know, there's been a tremendous transformation of the WHO. And I'm very grateful that Alana's landed, and we still have Alana within the WHO and in the field of ageing. So that's a plus for us. She oversees the organisation's work on age-friendly environments. And I was at APEC earlier this year, and every second country was talking about age-friendly environments. And within that umbrella, what actually fits under that. So it's a program that's globally booming. and also the development of a global campaign to combat ageism. And I think several speakers today have mentioned ageism and age discrimination as a significant barrier for older people on the journey to equality. Added to that, Alana oversees the development of the Decade of Healthy Ageing 2020 to 2030, and IFA has been fortunate to be an observer on some very important conversations with the UN and UN DESA and UN agencies about the decade, as well as member states. And we're very much hoping that civil society can get behind this decade in partnership with government and other sectors and disciplines. Prior to that, Alana was the coordinator of the Disability and Rehabilitation team with the Department of Violence and Injury Prevention, where she led the development of landmark resources such as the WHO Global Disability Action Plan 2014 to 2021, Better Health for All People with Disability, and the World Report on Disability. These are just some examples of the depth of experience and commitment that Alana has to these fields of study, but to individuals. And I think one of the lasting images that I have of Alana is when Alana was committed to doing a keynote address many years ago. And Isla, Alana's daughter, would have been 8 months old. 8 months old. So no babysitter. So what does Alana do? Handles the keynote with Isla on her hip. So that's the kind of person Alana is. On the downside, Isla is now 6 and tells Alana what to do, but, that's another story. Committed professional, but a human being that really fights for justice in these particular areas. So please welcome Alana, Officer.
Terrific. Thanks, Jane. And thanks very much to the NGO committee, to DESA and to the group of friends for the opportunity to be with you today. So, as Jane said, I'm going to talk a bit about the decade of healthy ageing. So, I think we've heard today that we need to think beyond demographics. We need to be thinking about the incredible diversity that exists in older age. We need to be focusing on inequities. And we need to be thinking very clearly about the centrality of health in terms of the experience of older age. So many of you will remember that in 2006, 194 member states of WHO adopted a global strategy and action plan on aging and health. It had 2 goals. One, to implement the evidence that we already had so we could make a difference in people's lives, but by next year, to develop the evidence and the partnerships necessary to support a decade of healthy aging from 2020 to 2030. And it's important. So in terms of the decade, it has really strong roots. It builds on the work of MIPA with a big, stronger focus on health. It aligns with WHO's new program of work called the GPW 13. It aligns with the SDGs, so the last 10 years of the SDGs. And it builds on the evidence base of the World Report on Aging and Health. This is the roadmap for the last year of what we've been doing to develop the decade. If you're like me, it's a little bit complex, so I'm going to break it down into some smaller steps. We started by asking people what they want. So we spoke to those responsible in governments in countries around, if over the next 10 years, what are the priorities for you? So there were 160 government respondents from 81 countries, and they said that they wanted to work on improved engagement with older people. They wanted a better understanding of older people's needs. They felt that it was important to develop and strengthen health and long-term care and improve our multi-sectoral action. Because this is not the first decade, and so standing on the shoulders of giants, we looked at 6 other decades and what worked and what didn't. And we looked at the success factors, ensuring that the decade has a powerful cause, having member state champions, and there are many of those in the room, and I'm grateful to you, having committed partners, particularly civil society, working not just to transform the issue, but also the ecosystem in which we work, providing practical solutions within the SDG framework, and ensuring cross-sectoral collaboration. So in the last year, we've had incredible opportunities to engage with member states and other actors to harness political opportunities and to listen to different perspectives. So the G20 has talked about aging and population aging. The health ministers have also been talking about it and the decade. APEC, as Jane mentioned, hosted by Chile, has also been discussing population aging and the implications of the decade going forward. Finland, who's the presidency of the European Union, also hosted in July a high-level forum on the silver economy. And there's been other opportunities through the World Health Assembly, through conferences like IFA and regional meetings where we've had the opportunity to engage with diverse stakeholders to hear their views on what the decade should cover. We also, if you have a look at it, Google, Decade of Healthy Aging, there's a platform there. We share updates on what we're doing each couple of months to get a sense of how that process is developing. We also ran an online survey in 6 languages for 2 months to get broad perspectives on what the decade should focus on. So to date, to give you an idea, 89 member states have been involved in the development of the proposal for the decade, 16 UN or international agencies, and I'm very grateful also to Amal for coordinating in terms of the interagency group on aging. It's a great resource for broader engagement across the UN, and about 300 non-state actors who have been engaged in this process. So what does the proposal say? And it currently says we need to make a difference in people's lives. We need to make a difference in the lives of older adults, in their families, and in their communities. And while it's guided by the global strategy in action, or the global strategy on aging and health, the decade will aim to stimulate local action that does 4 things. And we've heard it, and it was really interesting listening to Paul, I think, about the 7 actions, and also Anthony, in terms of what can be done. And there's great alignment, I think, between what you'll see on the 4 action areas for the decade and the enablers with what also has been suggested by others. Changing how we think, feel, and act towards age and aging. Ensuring that our communities develop, and that means the policies, systems, and services that exist, develop in ways that foster the abilities of older adults. That older people get access to the integrated care within primary health care that they need, and that those people who experience declines in capacity can get the support through long-term care. The decade is intended to build those connections and collaborations with government and civil society, academia, private sector, international organizations and the media, and diverse professionals, but ensuring that older adults are central to each of the steps in terms of the development of the decade and its implementation. There's also a sense that we need to do things differently. So if we're really going to generate concrete action and change, we're looking at setting up a platform which enables change through partnering on hearing and responding to the voices of older adults and other community members and enabling their engagement, nurturing leadership and capacities at all the levels, whether it be at the sort of national level or at the local level, for which change needs to happen across, connecting stakeholders, and fostering research data, knowledge exchange, and innovation. So just to say, going back, one of the things that you would have seen in the goals was establish the evidence partnerships for a decade. So what I wanted to do was just highlight a couple of things that we've been doing in that regard that will support the implementation of the decade. So WHO runs a global network for age-friendly cities and communities. In 2006, when the strategy was adopted, we had 280 cities or communities in that network. In the last 3 years, that has tripled, so there's over 1,000 cities and communities in 41 countries covering about 250 million people. It is currently one of the fastest growing transnational networks in the world. Last week, we launched some new guidelines. It's really important that older people get person-centered integrated care. So we've released some guidance on how do you do those assessments, how do you provide those care, what's the evidence-based for that. There is an application that can enable that assessment and choices around care pathways, and there's guidance for how you improve systems and services. We've also been working hard on ageism. Many of you will know that there are one-off studies on prevalence, scattered evidence, particularly around health, no real comprehensive understanding of what countries are doing, and no real evidence of what actually works. So we've done a global prevalence study, we've done a review of policy, we've done a series of systematic reviews to understand the determinants of ageism, the consequences of ageism, what works and how do you measure it. And we've also done a qualitative study on existing campaigns and lessons that we can learn. This is just a brief idea to say, we start with these strategies, we build the evidence-based, we're going to look at launching a global report next year on ageism, pulling together that evidence. There's the Decade platform that will support dissemination and use, and around also building a global coalition which we hope will influence legislation, training, national campaigns, and intergenerational activities. Evidence suggests if you can change the attitudes and how people think, feel, and act in 1 in every 4 persons, we can get a global transformative social change. That's what we want. Here is the website and a direct email if you're interested. Thank you very much.
Your last point about changing attitudes. If I look across the panel today, and the messages from the ILO, and then the messages from Krishna, and the messages from Elizabeth, this is, in each of these strands, we're really working to change attitudes. I guess one of my questions in the next session to you, Alana, will be, how can we work collectively? Because one of the challenges that we all have, and I won't call it silos, but, civil society and ILO, civil society and WHO, with Elizabeth's initiatives. So I wonder whether this platform that you mentioned may be one of the keys. So I'll put that question just on the table. As a moderator, it's always challenging to keep people to time. So I thank all of the speakers for keeping to time so that we can have some discussion. And the first set of questions really talk about entrepreneurship. And I do want to make mention that on the 9th of October, AARP, Erica, had a side event. And I just loved the name of this side event, which was Not Every Good Idea Comes Wrapped in a Hoodie. How older entrepreneurs are helping to change the technological landscape. And I think that's really, central to our conversation. So, Elizabeth and the panellists, I want to talk with you about entrepreneurship from your different perspectives. Vinicius, from the perspective of income security and social protection. Elizabeth, for you, there are a couple of questions about, my words, not theirs, great idea, but where are the resources to help support older people in becoming entrepreneurs? Where does that come from? And then I'd like to just touch base with each of the panellists from their different perspectives. Elizabeth?
Where the resources come from for older entrepreneurs? That is something that we're continuing to build a body of evidence about what the economic ROI is for senior entrepreneurs. Once I did the first program for the Senate in the United States, and it was the first that they had on senior entrepreneurship, and first people looked at me like, senior entrepreneurship, is that an oxymoron? And I said, no. And I said, when Senator Mary Landrieu, who convened and asked me to design this hearing for the Senate, she said, what do you need from us? So I'd like to turn that question around and say, I would like to tell you what we can do for you and what we can do for this country, and it has enormous ramifications, not just economically, but health-wise, and we're not depleting the healthcare system. We are paying taxes. Entrepreneurs who are starting businesses are hiring people. They're building economies locally and globally. So what I am also doing because I do have a practical side, believe it or not, in working with the Federal Reserve Bank, those pointers that I had at the end of my slideshow is exactly, I wrote a paper with the director of building entrepreneurial communities at the Federal Reserve Bank to let his economic directors know what they could do to support a senior entrepreneur in the community, because he gets it, and he gets what they are doing to the economy. So it's building those intergenerational spaces. It's building training resources. And it's something that the community can do, to your point earlier, how do we all work together? Instead of having different people in the community supporting some kind of workforce training program, have everybody collaborate on who's going to be the subject of this workforce training, and even more, what do the businesses in this community need? We have to start talking with one another. And so I think that's how I would address that.
Good. Look, thank you. And if we can keep the responses short, then we'll get through a lot more. So, Vinicius, would you like to make a quick comment about that?
No, absolutely. And I have a very interesting story, very short, that happened to me just yesterday. I was going to give a lecture at Columbia University. I had to move from my office here in downtown, Midtown to Columbia, and I ordered a car. And there was this gentleman, he was over 65 maybe, and I was quite late, and he was not really following the Google Maps, the traffic things. And then I had like 45 minutes to get there, and then I said, okay, but you're not going to follow the... He said, no, because this app is sending everybody to that street, so I'm going the other direction, and I got there faster. And actually, it took him like 10 minutes more or less than the... But just to say, then I said, but you should get your own app, right? And then he said, no, actually, I'm giving feedback to the company because of these things, because the system is not working well. So that's an example in which experience, as you mentioned, is factoring into the entrepreneurship element, in particular the IT that you also alluded to. They're having mechanisms to capture what this gentleman put on the table to improve the app. So I think it was a quite interesting story. Yes, thank you.
Good, thank you. Krishna, did you want to make a comment about entrepreneurship in Nepal?
No, the first thing about is the mental attitude of the people. When you talk about, I went to our ILO office or many other government offices also where they help to generate work. They say, why older people? When we have so many youth, they are unemployed. I said, yeah, it's not, who should work should not be disintegrated by age. Anyone who is surviving, healthy, and can contribute to the society and can contribute to, see himself worthful or his useful life should be given opportunity. So this is a very deep conversation that we have to sit down with the governments and convince the entire society. I think more mass communication has to play much more important role here in changing the attitude. Thank you.
Alana, I'm going to give you a different question. Just to say that we've got about 30 questions here in front of me, and if we don't get through them, and we won't, could I suggest that we actually type them all up, and then I will share them with the panellists to see whether we can get some answers from them, because your questions are important just as much as the respondents. Alana, you're leading the campaign to combat ageism. It really disturbs me that I'm riding a motorbike and someone my age is not supposed to, not seen to be safe riding a motorbike. But that's just a minor thing. Access to screening for vision for eye exams, access to oncology treatments for some older people. So it really hits at the heart of this notion of healthy ageing. Could you comment, seeing as you've done some work in this area, how collectively civil society can be part of this campaign to combat ageism? What's the evidence around
There's a number of questions there, Jane. I think we need to understand that ageism is a fundamentally limiting factor in terms of the potential of us all to age well and to do what we value. So I think we've been working on ageism now for about 50 years, I mean, since the word was coined. And there's an incredible amount of progress that needs to be made. So I think from WHO's perspective, that progress needs to be made based on the best available evidence. And so, which is really where we've invested an inordinate amount of time and resources to understand what is the evidence around what works. And I think that there's a great opportunity that we hope we're opening up for civil society, is to take that evidence base, which we will talk about really the extent of the problem, which is massive. We'll talk about a better understanding of what those consequences are in terms of ageism and how it impacts on people's lives. And also the fact that there are a lot of things that people do that just don't work, yeah? And that there are only two things that actually there is evidence on effectiveness in terms of addressing ageism. And that is around education and on intergenerational activities. But it's how you do those things, and often the fact that you have to do them together if you're going to actually generate any change. But that there are huge gaps in terms of the evidence that we also need to address. It's another opportunity for academics, researchers, and civil society to engage in filling those evidence-based gaps so that we're actually investing in things and activities and actions which are likely to generate the sort of change that we want to see in the world.
And of course, this work and the campaign really feeds into the conversations within the open-ended working group, around protecting the rights of older people and the convention that we will have in my lifetime. So another question, how can we mainstream age diversity and older persons in the workforce of national economies while also protecting retirement and social protection schemes? I think that's your question, Vinicius.
Yeah, no, I was giving a thought about this issue of mainstream age diversity. So should we go for mainstream age diversity or for combating discrimination against? So that's a different perspective. Now, of course, if you say now every company has to hire a certain number of, old age people, it might not go, might be possible, or maybe you're going to have a reaction. But if you say we should avoid any type of discrimination and have mechanisms in place, I think that's more consistent, let's say, also with perspectives from employers and from workers. Absolutely, as I said in my presentation, the combination between active aging, policies to stimulate labor force participation for those who want, so it has to be combined with choice, backed by universal social protection, and the third component is precisely lifelong learning. So these three components together can produce, let's say, a flexible framework in which you can make the most of the old age participation in the labor force.
Okay, thank you. This is a pretty tricky question. Is the root challenge not resource scarcity, but transformational thinking? The question is really, we're talking about, we have within our midst sexism, racism, ageism. So how do we think differently? How do we act differently? And how do we inform governments and policy so the transformational changes within the intergovernmental sector as well as within the community? Elizabeth, your light's on. Does that mean that you're going to answer that one?
Oh, I always have something to say. It is a huge transformation, and what we sometimes forget, and again, when we talk about the dependency ratio, this is a transformation that people want to engage in. Businesses want to engage in it because they see that this is a problem that has to be solved. Governments the same way, and certainly individuals want to participate in it. We just did a new research that I referred to in my presentation at the University of Michigan on the life course of entrepreneurship. And we submitted that to 8,000 individuals. The return rate on those surveys was 86%. And anybody that's done any kind of research knows that's absolutely phenomenal. So the seniors, the older people, want to be included. These were all older people that took the survey. And it was like, thank God somebody asked my opinion. And it's just extraordinary. And it is transformational, but that doesn't have to be a negative. That's hugely positive.
Okay, could I just also challenge that there is no such thing as a dependency ratio? And you know, there can be many conversations about this, but I think dependency ratio definitions need to be either reviewed dramatically or thrown out, because we're talking about working age group of 15 to 64. So I think we still use this, and I think that's also part of the conversation that we need to change. Just to give you some context, in the next 10 or 15 minutes, we will all have the privilege of closing remarks from the President of the General Assembly. And so we're going to just keep going gently, but I will ask each of the panellists to think of one single message, the take-home message that you want the audience to take away from what you've been saying. So we'll start that just after the next question so that we're ready for the President. A question comes about inclusion. How can we have total inclusion throughout the world to provide care to older people? Where does the funding come from? And I will respond initially and say, all older people don't need care, if we're talking about it in the formal sense. So I think that we've actually got to think about, you know, a person as part of their journey in life. Some will require services to assist them, you know, in remaining autonomous and independent. Some won't do. So every older person is a unique individual, and it really comes back to, you know, the models of services versus the models of care. But is there anybody that would... Krishna, you were nodding. Would you like to say anything?
No, I think the society is for everybody, for people of all ages. So, but we have not been very equal in terms of employment. In terms of banks, have not been very equal to lending money. Like one of the cases today we got was a lady was denied bank loan despite of all the enough collateral because she couldn't sign her name. And she's happy because now she can sign her name. So it's equal treatment from all the state services and society services and goods we have, we should have access to. And learning never stops. And our society is changing so fast with new technologies, and they are getting more and more we are making our life more and more complicated. So if we don't give enough opportunity for older people to get themselves learn something new and to get updated, they are going to fall behind.
Okay, so a question
I'd just like to chime in. Sure. One tiny point here is one of the most devastating things in society today is isolation. And we all know that causes depression, and that all of those create diseases, if you will, or situations that need to be treated by medical care. And as the Secretary General said this morning, that we need to find ways to make contributions from older people more possible, because when they contribute, they remain healthy longer because they feel relevant. And that's a huge point that we need to make in terms of health care.
Do you know, Elizabeth, it's interesting, but one of the questions that we have here, which sounds quite simple but is actually quite complicated, is what can families do to contribute to respecting and valuing older people? So it comes back to ourselves, you know, and then, you know, this whole person-centred, you know, approach to living. So, yeah, did you want to...
I mean, it seems that each of these questions, you know, again, a fundamental root of the challenge is ageism. So even when we're talking about families and how they might care for older adults, it's based on their perception of older family members, and the contribution that they can make. Whether we're talking about healthcare and long-term care provision, you know, we've got, because so many of us tend to be ageist, and therefore that influences how we think and the sorts of policies that we develop. And if you think of older age as this period of dependency, then it's not so, and we look at dependency ratios, then it's not so surprising that we all think about cost containment, and close it down. And so we don't make the right investments, and we don't make those investments that can then foster healthy aging and enable continued contribution and engagement. So, I mean, I think this is really a fundamental problem, whether you're thinking about the individuals themselves, and we know ageism has huge effects on our own health, whether it be on families, whether it be on health and social care providers and others, or whether it be on policymakers.
So a question was directed to myself, and then we're going to go and ask the panellists for their takeaway. The question was, I agree that we need to stop preaching to the choir, but who do we preach to? In the work that IFA does, we bring together a cross-discipline approach. So if we're concerned about access to eye exams, we'll bring ophthalmologists, optometrists, educators, all organisations in the field of ageing, but also Diabetes Association, because there's a link between diabetes and eye complications. So we're actually talking to a whole different cadre of people now, organisations, because an older person will touch every one of those points across their journey if their eyes are deteriorating. So thank you for all of your questions. So we'll start with Vinicius. So what's your takeaway message to the attendees today?
Yeah, so basically, I think the main takeaway is the active aging should be anchored in human rights, but is also economic necessity. It should be a matter of choice, opportunity, adequate, safe, and health work environments, and backed by social protection and lifelong learning schemes. That's the sum up of my presentation.
Thank you. And if you can write that down, we will post it on the on websites. All right. Thank you very much. Elizabeth, your takeaway message.
My takeaway message is that the aging demographic is a huge opportunity. It is not a silver tsunami. It's an unprecedented opportunity in human history, and I would like us to think about that word experience, which you've heard many times today. And I would like you to think about experience not just as a noun in terms of what we have and our accumulated knowledge and facts, but experience as a verb. We need to draw on that experience of individuals, and we need to reciprocate across generations to catalyze it and turn it into a verb. And how are we going to use that experience to boost economic prosperity for people of all ages in all places across the world?
Thank you very much. Krishna?
I think to very simple, it's a lot can be talked about on the subject, but the simple would be the society is changing very fast, and that's good. But we are left behind. I mean, older people are left behind. That's the problem. So it's on the both sides. Society should also create situation where lifelong learning is possible. And I think older people will also be very eager in coming forward to put themselves current in the society, which try to learn and everything. For that, enabling environment should be there.
I think that's a very important message to hear from Krishna, because we often hear the catchphrase, leave no one behind. And you're saying from Nepal, some of us are feeling as though we're being left behind. And so I think that's a strong message for us to take away today. Alana?
Thanks, Jane. In terms of take-home message, I think change is possible. I think the decade of healthy aging provides us with an incredible opportunity to improve the lives of older adults, their families and their communities. And it's going to require collective action. And I hope that together we can create this sort of space where we move from talking to acting and really starting to make a difference in people's lives.
Thank you very much. The word potential has been used, across the course of the meeting as well. And it seems that one of the challenges that we've got is really that systems also limit the potential of older people, and society may actually limit the potential of older people as well. And so I think that's something that we need to capture not only in the work that we do, but the narratives that we put forward. One of the things that hasn't really come through in the discussions today is the psychological impact of being an older person in society, in some societies that don't see them as worthy or of value. And it's a theme that came through in a couple of the questions. Did any of you want to sort of touch on that? Because picking up, Elizabeth, on what you said around loneliness and isolation, I'm stunned by the report from the UK some years ago that talked about 1 million older people in the United Kingdom, reported that they don't talk to anybody in a month. So I wonder how we can capture that in the conversations around, the implementation of activities in the decade, for example. Have we thought about that as yet? Yes.
Sure. It gets, if we're talking about loneliness, I think you have to start talking about childhood, yeah? So we know that age-based stereotypes start from about the age of 4 or 5, yeah? So children who are very young already get a sense of how age is portrayed within their culture. And, so dependency, it's normal to be lonely, decrepitude is part of the aging process. These are things that tend to play out and children are very sensitive of. Obviously, across the life course, if you continue to be exposed to those stereotypes and you inculcate them across your life course, then you're going to believe them. So there is the attitude of then people don't reach out to older people because loneliness and isolation is something that's typical in older age. Older people do not reach out also because they inculcate that that's normal. Children are off doing their thing, so it's normal that I'm left behind. So if you don't tackle ageism in schools and with young children, then you're going to also have, older adults who are lonely at the end. Obviously, there are big issues around infrastructure, transportation, IT access. We've heard a number of those things, housing, that impact significantly also on social isolation and loneliness. But I think a fundamental root of that is changing how people perceive older age and older people if we're going to, eliminate loneliness.
And we're doing it. We're the ones that are ageing, and we can be part of the movement. Krishna, from a rural perspective in Nepal, are there differences that you see in terms of older people that are living in villages versus, in rural environments?
Yes, actually, and the third dimension of is rural people moving to cities because of rapid urbanization. That's another part, which is so we are not the same environment or same society living anymore. The society is changing fast, but the older people do not get enough training or the learning opportunity to adjust to wherever they go. So the way I have found is and supported. And thank you very much for everybody who supported it. Is at their 78, 80 years of age, we are giving them 30 more friends to talk and discuss every day in their classroom. I think we also remember our classmates very dearly. So classmates are important, but the older people, when they leave the village and come to urbanization, they have left no friends to talk to, and so we have to create a new friends. And I think classroom is the best place that they can giggle and enjoy the same childhood that we had remember our classmates. We enjoyed funny that.
I do think, though, that what we struggle with as we get older is loss, the loss that goes on around us. And I often hear, my mother say, who's 92, I better go soon because there'll be no one to come to my funeral because everyone else has died. And that's probably true. But, but it's a very challenging time because, changes in function, loss of mobility, loss of friends, then from an environmental perspective, loss of transportation opportunities, and just sheer exhaustion. At 92, my mum's just tired, and that's fair enough. So it's such a complicated, mosaic, and we expect policies to respond, in one way when that's just, it's not possible. So, Elizabeth, in terms of your work, have you been working, in less developed countries as well with the program of entrepreneurship?
Yes, we work in developing and developed countries around the world, and some of the most exciting cases come out of Africa, where older entrepreneurs are working with younger entrepreneurs, and the younger entrepreneurs are bringing their technology skills to the older, particularly older women in Africa, who have been running subsistence farms to care for their families, and many of these people are caring for their grandchildren because of the AIDS epidemic. And so it's really what's most significant here, and this crosses all geographic boundaries, is that if you have a problem and present it to an intergenerational group of how to solve it, you present a challenge. In some cases, it's, bringing electricity to communities, and they bring these, sun equipment to generate electricity, but it's all through that intergenerational component, and it doesn't happen naturally. You purposefully have to bring generations together, because the younger generation has to know what's in it for them to talk to these old fuddy-duddies, and the old fuddy-duddies are thinking, well, why should I bother with these people that don't even care about me? But if you present a problem, like the Barbara Beskind that I showed you earlier, when she said, have you ever asked us what we want? And she suddenly started working and counseling people at IDEO on these products. And just naturally, the younger people are coming to her and saying, do you think this will work? Do you think that will work? So suddenly, they respect what this woman brings to the table, regardless of her age. She has an idea that's going to help them. And they indirectly help her, because she has suddenly been asked to design some of these products herself. And she wanted to be an engineer her entire life. And at age 91, she got to be one, finally. So you really have to have this cross-generational engagement, because it is the life course, and it's all of our lives at stake. So just ask people. You don't have to know the answers. It's even better if you don't know the answers. Just ask someone a question, and it's just amazing, the information and experience that's brought forth to solve something that seemed insolvable.
And of course, it's vitally important, literacy, to be able to be asking the questions. And I think, in every unique situation, and I think Krishna has made a point very clearly today, that we really have to be, the bottom-up approach, talking with, older people in their own settings to understand the cultural nuances, so that any programs that are developed need to be developed by an organisation such as Ageing Nepal. I think one of the challenges, I think sometimes what we do wrong is organisations parachute into another country and expect to be able to just drop a program in. And that's not the way that we need to be doing it. It's really about the relationships that we build with civil society so that you can drive the agenda. From an ILO perspective, yes,
yep.
Sure.
It's just a very important point. I worked for development work for many years. In that, what we are supposed to do is go to community, ask them what do they want to learn, and provide the same training. But whenever somebody, old person came, we never asked them, no, you are old man. You don't need training or anything. No, you are out. We are just talking to the youth. So I think we should have asked that question to the all ages. And also, one of the important thing, I think it looked funny too, when we started our literature class, in our language we started ABCD. They say, hey, come on, don't bother us with all this ABCD. Teach me how to write my name. I said, first you have to go through it. So identify their need and give them what they want. And I think we can do that. It's not a very difficult thing to do. If you are committed, we can. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure moderating this panel today, and I'm sure that they have conveyed some very key messages that are worthy of taking away and really exploring in our own context. So could you please join with me in thanking the panellists? It is now my great privilege to introduce the President of the 74th session of the General Assembly. But before I do that, I would also like to acknowledge His Excellency Mr. Jero Beam Sharnika, Deputy Chef de Cabinet, Mr. Alexander Stutzman, Director of Social and Humanitarian Priority, Mr. Emmanuel Tillman, Senior Advisor. As I said, it's my great pleasure to introduce the President of the 74th session of the General Assembly, His Excellency Mohammed Bande is an outstanding scholar in political science and diplomacy with an academic career and policy development which is tremendous. He has won merit awards and honours from institutions and governments, including the Government of the United States of America and the Government of China. Most notably, he was named Officer of the Order of the Federal Republic, one of Nigeria's highest national honours. But what struck me, and by way of introduction, I share with you the comments of the UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres when he said this year, "Sir, you bring many important and admirable qualifications to the job, from your years as permanent representative of Nigeria, from your wide-ranging academic pursuits. You are an expert in political science and public administration. And as a Nigerian and an African, you have invaluable insights into the continent's challenges and more broadly into the challenges of our world, facing across three pillars of the world: peace, sustainable development and human rights. Please welcome His Excellency Mohammed Bande. Your Excellency, the rights of older people are human rights.
Excellencies, esteemed panelists, distinguished delegates, I thank the organizers of today's important event, including the NGO Committee on Aging, DESA, the Permanent Mission of Argentina, and the Group of Friends of Older Persons. The International Day of Older Persons offers us a moment to reflect upon the role of older persons as active contributors to society and not merely as passive recipients of care and assistance. Inclusion is a foundational priority for the 74th session, which weaves through every element of our work. We will not have a UN that excludes. We must ensure that older persons are recognized as stakeholders in every element of our work. The number of people aged 60 and older is set to outnumber youth by 2030. We must therefore enable this section of society to engage in every facet of our work here at the United Nations and beyond. How can we achieve our goals if we exclude this demographic? If we are to make progress, we must ensure age-inclusive implementation of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, not just today, but every day. Excellencies, the journey to age equality requires collective action to remove barriers that exclude and discriminate against older persons, to enable all people to age with security and dignity, while fully participating in society. I encourage member states to adopt and implement non-discriminatory policies, legislation, and regulations to empower older persons and ensure their full participation in societies. Today, panelists addressed key issues which will facilitate progress in this area, most notably societal and structural changes. These include adaptive labor policies, social protection, universal health coverage, and lifelong learning. Lifelong education is essential to ensure the full and active participation of older persons in society. We have therefore prioritized quality education during the 74th session. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, let me conclude by calling on all member states to seize this opportunity to take into account issues of relevance to older persons in their efforts to promote the attainment of Sustainable Development Goals. I plan to engage older persons to help elevate the profile of aging and ensure that we properly situate their interests within the global development agenda. I look forward to hearing of the outcomes of the human rights situation of aged people in Africa conference, which will take place in Abuja, Nigeria, in November 2019. I hope that we maintain the momentum of this International Day as we work toward the open-ended working group on aging taking place in April 2019. Excellencies, I'm sure you know I'm also part of this demographic, being over 60. Therefore, I'm talking about myself. I also leave you with a Nigerian proverb which says, what an elder can see while sitting down, a child cannot see even when he climbs a tree. I thank you.
Well, we thank you, His Excellency, for your energizing and committed concluding remarks. And we thank you, all the participants and the audience, for making this a positive and sharing event. Today's event is over. The journey to age equality is not. We're all agents to make it happen, as Jane Barrett pointed out. Now we will have to ask you to swiftly evacuate the room. Please exit the way you came. Second floor exit for those that came in that way. Third floor for the majority. A last reminder to those that signed up for the fundraising luncheon. We all meet at Alora, situated at 145th East 47th Street between 3rd Avenue and Lexington. Unfortunately, the list is full, so we can't take any walk-ins. We meet at 2 o'clock only. That is in 1 hour. So please take the opportunity to visit the bookstore or have some interesting discussions on the UN premises before heading over. Thanks a lot again for coming here today.